quiz. But there are lecture quizzes that have been occurring along the way as well. So most recently, they've been occurring frequently, but most recently, this lecture quiz on the skin. Now remember that the lecture quizzes that we have online, these are suggested due dates for those. So we finished skin last week. We started just a little bit of skeletal system. So in theory, you had the information just like you did in lab for doing skin. So doing that lecture quiz on skin was possible on Sunday. But if you didn't do it then, it's totally fine. But make sure that you're doing those on regular intervals. Don't wait for those to pile up. Otherwise, they're not doing us any good as small checks and balances to see how we're doing on content.
Just a question on that. So, let's say you kind of take it a little bit late. It doesn't let you do another attempt, though.
Right. So, for any of the lecture quizzes, the way that those work, that very first one we had, that was like the orientation quiz on the syllabus and stuff like that, that was the only one that actually lets you do 2 of them. These ones, they only let you do 1. But the good thing about it is that these are untimed. So what you want to do is study for it as if it is a closed book, closed internet, whatever, closed notes quiz, okay? So that you're studying it as if it was just like the test out in front of you. Go through and answer the questions, but then before you submit it, go ahead and double check those answers with your lecture notes or whatever you want to make sure that your score is nice and high, but that way at least you can see, oh, I was almost going to submit that as the wrong answer, and that one, I guess maybe I didn't know this as well as I did, I thought I did, or great. Each one of those, I double checked them, they're all good, great, I'm going to submit it, and I seem fine with that.
Yeah, I actually didn't realize that, so I kind of
ran through it or whatever. So anytime there's some sort of a glitch or whatever, if you're coming up with any sort of issue, go ahead and send me an email about it, and we can see what we can do. You know, there haven't been times when I've had lab quizzes where, for instance, for whatever reason, the picture that I was supposed to have didn't show up, and so it was taking some time to get that up and running and get that reassociated with it. Sometimes an internet connection will drop or whatever, so if you do have any problems with any of our online assessments or resources, just let me know. Same thing in terms of like Panopto. If it seems like Panopto is glitching, like if you're looking at those recordings and it's glitching, like the audio drops or anything like that, do let me know. I don't usually go in there regularly and double check on our recordings, but each and every time we meet for lecture, they are going into the Panopto folder. So as we get closer to, say, a lecture exam like a week from today, you may be reviewing those more. So all of them should be in there through time. They're all organized by date. I do change the title as well to say what we're covering that day. So as with any of our online resources, if there's any problem with anything, just shoot me an email and we can figure out a solution. Okay? Okay, so we can see lab quizzes, lecture quizzes, lab quizzes. There's another lecture quiz coming up that will be this coming Sunday on skeletal system. The lab quizzes that we have coming up are split into 2 separate weeks. So this time when you go to the module that's talking about skeletal system and you look at the lecture, it says, okay, well, here's the lecture notes for chapter 7, read chapter 7, etc. But then when you go to the lab section, it says that there are 2 separate labs for the 2 weeks coming up. So the first lab quiz has to do with bones, like generic bones like we were talking about last time, like what's the epiphysis and what's compact bone or spongy bone, things like that. And so just bone as a tissue, like the name of bone cells are called osteocytes, etc. Things we're going to review today. And then the other part of that quiz is it's going through the bones of the axial skeleton. So the axial skeleton are along your main axis. So it's going to include the skull, which is a knot of bones, and then the vertebral column, etc. And so that's definitely enough for a quiz. So we break it there. And then the second week, so not this weekend, but in 2 weekends, then we're going to do the appendicular skeleton. And then we'll also do joints, which is something we'll talk about at the lecture. So where bones come together, what type of joints there are. There are fibrous joints where they're effectively sewn together. There are cartilaginous joints where there's a somewhat flexible piece of cartilage holding them together. And then most commonly, there are synovial joints that are freely movable joints that have synovial membranes, synovial fluid, and all this type of thing. So we do get into joint classification as well as kind of specific movements as well as we move these joints. What does it mean to extend a joint or to rotate a joint or something like that? Okay, so that's broken into the second lab quiz that will occur in 2 weeks. So you do want to make sure that you get the lecture quiz for skeletal system done by the end, because of course we have our first lecture exam 1 week from today. And that includes everything from the beginning intro chapter through our chemistry chapter, in terms of talking about atoms and electrons and ways that we make atoms bond in terms of like ionic bonds and covalent bonds and all that type of thing. Then we move to cell, so knowing all the different organelles that go into the cell, talking about the plasma membrane, how we move things across, like diffusion and osmosis and active transport, what are those things? And then from there, we actually jumped up to starting to talk about skin, our first major system, talking about the 2 layers of the skin, talking about the functions of the skin, talking about all the different accessory organs like you saw in the quizzes pack this weekend, okay? But a little bit more detail because we're talking about lecture material. And then the skeletal system, this most recent one that we're in now, is also included on exam 1. So it's 5 chapters on exam 1, okay? And we'll talk a little bit more about the exam in terms of the format on Thursday as we finish up this. We should have time, since we have that little jump ahead in terms of our schedule for skeletal system, we should have some extra time on Thursday to then be done with the new lecture material and just kind of go back and review and ask questions and do some practice questions and things like that. Okay? But I cannot stress enough that in terms of preparing for the lecture exams tend to have a bit more information on them, a bit more detailed information on them as well. Between the 2 components of the class, we have the lab and we have the lecture. Labs, we try to help out. We know that the lecture component is going to be a little bit tougher because it's a lot of detail. A lot of times we're talking about the physiology, how these things on a subcellular level work and how they interact. We're talking about the cells. We'll talk later about action potentials and like movement of charged particles and all this stuff that you can't really put your hands on. I mean, granted, you guys are in a hybrid class, you're not putting your hands on a lot of things anyway, but you know what I mean in terms of microscopic as opposed to macroscopic things that you can actually see. So when we get to lecture exams, it is a bit more detailed. It's a bit more physiology, like how do these, not just what's that, but how do these things work? We've been doing a bit of that when we do our quizzes. Name this and tell me what it does. But there's a lot more physiology that we include in lecture because that's where we talk about, again, how things function. We'll talk about how bones form today. There's no model that shows endochondral ossifications or fetal bones turning into from cartilage to bone. But that is something that we talk about as it happens in the body and as it relates to how we grow and develop. So it's something we've been talking about on a lecture exam, but you won't see on a lab quiz. So we try to make those distinct from each other, even though there's overlap. We try to make those distinct from each other. So the lecture exam that we do next week is covering the stuff that we talk about here in lecture, including the stuff that you read in the book, okay? So anything that we talk about in here, anything that you read in the chapter that you have in the lecture notes, that's what we would have test questions on. Now, to be sure, like I explained in the beginning, when I'm doing my lectures and when we have the lecture notes, those outlines, they are highlighting the important points. When you read the chapter, you will find there's even more detail in there, etc. Most of the information you're going to need to know, you're going to get from the lecture itself. And the book just tends to reinforce that, and then add in details, and then, the good figures and tables and stuff like that that summarize. But lecture exam that we're doing next week is lecture material. And you do want to make sure that you're practicing as well. That's why we have the lecture quizzes to kind of see how you're doing. But if there's any way that you can test yourself or have other people test you or quiz you, that works really well to see how well you're doing. Because it's one thing for you to say, oh, I've been studying anatomy and physiology for forever. I studied this class way more than any other class. I got a B in that English class and I did half the amount of work. So I'm definitely going to get an A in this A&P class because I'm studying twice as long. Definitely there's a good correlation between amount of time spent studying and grade. Right? But just quantity doesn't necessarily mean that it's all sinking in, you're understanding it, right? You could look at that same page like 5 different times, and if it's something that just doesn't speak to you or you don't understand it, it doesn't matter if you do it 6 and 7 times, it's still going to be the same, I don't get it, right? So you want to do those checks. So even something as simple as making flashcards, like physical flashcards, old school 3.5 by 5-inch cards that you can put in your bag and you're standing in the line for Starbucks or something like that and you're flipping through the different types of synovial joints or something like that, or the different organelles and then what they do on the back. That type of thing is really good to help you learn because it breaks it into one little thing that you're focusing on right then, rather than like, oh, I have to know everything about cell. That's too much. It's overwhelming. You break it into little chunks, and then it's easier, right? I tell my kids, right, they got a little part of their dinner, like the vegetables they don't want to eat. You're looking at that big part, and it seems overwhelming. If they just do a little bit at a time, it's going to disappear, right? So a little bit of that knowledge at a time makes it a little bit easier. There's Quizlet, there's different types of online apps, there's apps you can get on your phone, you can create flashcards as well. There's all kinds of things that can help you study, but also it's a check. If you're looking at the flashcard, you're like rough endoplasmic reticulum, and you're like, I don't know, I think you said something, it's like attached to the nucleus, but I don't know what it does. If you can't get the answer without flipping that card over, then imagine if that question was on the exam, it says, describe the function of the rough endoplasmic reticulum. There certainly will be multiple choice questions on there, and a lot of them. But it's not all going to be that way, and so you've got to be able to make sure that you know the material. Likewise, if you have a chance to get together with somebody and have them quiz you. I mean, right, you can hand over your lecture notes or whatever and say, okay, ask me what is on that page, right? Ask me all the different organelles and I'll tell you what they do, right? That's the same thing. Even if they don't know what it is, even if it's a roommate, they're not taking the class, they have the answers there. And if you're telling them, they can match up what you're saying to what they have written on the page in front of them. So do those checks early, because definitely with an introductory science course and with these online things are a little bit easier. We're trying to kind of create them a little bit easier so that they all go into the same pot of points. So these lecture exams, which aren't created to be harder, but definitely have harder topics in them, they can help even those things out when we look at our overall grade, right? Like the lecture quizzes, those are easy, right? You can look at your notes, etc. But the lecture exams, they won't be that way. So you want to make sure that you prepare, okay? So do those checks, see how you're doing, and do them early. We've got a week. Don't wait until the night before and you're like, I'll just stay up a few extra hours. You don't get in there. And then I'll just like walk like this so it doesn't spill out my ears before I get there and just go, whoa, onto the page, right? Some of that may work, you bone up on those last details, but you can't get all of this information in there in that short amount of time. Even with stuff like diffusion, high concentration here in the book, low concentration here in the brain, like sleeping on the book, it's only going to get you so far, right? You got to do some active transport, spend some energy to push that stuff where it needs to go, right? Okay. So I don't want you guys to be surprised. I want you to be prepared and kind of exit coming out of it and feeling like, oh, I don't know exactly how I did, but I felt like I knew a lot of that stuff. I had stuff to put down for each of those questions, or I felt pretty confident in each of those answers. Okay? Okay. So any questions in terms of things that we're doing these days? Any quizzes and any of the things we've talked about before? Yeah?
So in preparation for the exam, would we want to focus on the contents of these study guides, or is there going to be a specific study guide that we find online that'll let us zero in on the core of the information of what we're going to know, or none of the above?
I would say all of the above instead. It's like D or something, right? Definitely the lecture notes that you have that are the PowerPoint handouts, that has a lot of the key information, just like the chapter outlines. When you go to the end of the chapter, it's got like a chapter outline or a chapter summary. That doesn't contain all the detail, but it's trying to give you the big picture. What are the important points? So these are kind of one step above there. When we look at those, there are other things that we talk about in terms of details that we add in, but that's the key information right there. So, yeah, studying the lecture notes and, kind of going over the Panopto lectures and whatever, that's the core content you need to know. Reading the book, that's going to help as well because, again, everything is based on the content in the book, but then that's adding another level of detail too. So you want to do that towards the end. But what we have in here in terms of the lecture notes is good. In terms of other preparatory materials, if we go to our modules, see if it's going to do that for us. Thinking. This first module here under study materials does have some materials for you. So these are exam objectives. These are lists of topics for each of the chapters. So it's like for chapter, 2 or whatever for chemistry, be able to describe a covalent bond, an ionic bond, and a hydrogen bond. I mean, it doesn't necessarily give you the answers, but it says, these are the 3 types of bonds, so you need to be able to define those. So those you can find right there as well. So I think a combination of those things would make sure that you're, as you're studying, you can tell, oh, okay, that's a topic, I need to make sure I can answer those. Yeah.
Okay, that's helpful.
Okay. Alrighty, I wonder if this still works. So there are some other links to some other resources that we have at the library. These are ebooks that we have at the library, so it means that as you log into those, they are references that are in electronic form. I'll have to take a look at those. Sometimes they change the web address in terms of linking, but as you can see. But some of those, if I can get those up and running again, they're just different textbooks. They're kind of like I said, like anatomy and physiology for dummies. They are text or study guides that help you to go. It goes through the material, but it just has the key points as opposed to all the detail as well. Okay, so with that, then we should probably get back to our skeletal system. So this is our second system of the body. So we started with integumentary system. We say that with an organ system, it's a number of organs that are working together, often connected together, that perform a particular function. So what we did is we did some of our introductory information where we talked about their particular function. So storage of minerals is one that everybody knew, and then protection and support, right? Like rib cage and skull and cranium, etc. Blood cell production was something that maybe people didn't know. It comes from one of the 2 different types of marrow that we have inside of bones. So there's 2 different types of marrow. Do you guys remember? Yeah, so they're different colors. So we have red and yellow. The blood cells that we have are red and white blood cells, and they all come from the red bone marrow. The yellow bone marrow is fat, it's adipose tissue, it's there for energy storage. So we know that bones are there for storage, both of minerals and now of fat. But it's the red bone marrow that is in that spongy bone, tends to be towards the ends, those epiphyses of the long bones. That's where we produce red blood cells, white blood cells, and even platelets. So that's certainly a function for bone as well. So we did overall functions of bone. We did this kind of tour of the bone as well, where we were saying the expanded ends of the bones, these are the epiphyses up here, the diaphysis is the shaft, and then here's that spongy bone that we were talking about. And then on the outside, we have compact bone. We said that this is organized in a way that's very densely packed and very, very strong. So the next thing we'll talk about, since we looked at it on a broad scale level, is we'll look down further and we'll talk about the cells involved. Because if these are organs and they're living organs, they must have living cells making up the tissues, making up the organs. Okay? So, the living cells that we have in there are going to be what are called osteocytes. So these are mature bone cells. Anytime you see osteo, that means bone. So osteopathic medicine has to do with the bones. If you talk about osteoporosis, that's holes in the bones, etc., in terms of a pathogenic condition. And then anytime you see cyte, C-Y-T-E, that means cell. Okay? So these are bone cells, and these are mature bone cells. Now we know that for this type of tissue, this is connective tissue. Bones are connective tissue. Rather than epithelial tissue where we have all these cells stuck to one another tightly, in connective tissues we have kind of a cell here, and a cell there, and a cell there, and then all of this extracellular matrix in between. That extracellular matrix may be fluid, like in the case of blood. It may be gel-like, like in the case of cartilage, or it may be calcified matrix in terms of bone. So if you're talking about these living cells called osteocytes sitting within this extracellular matrix, but the extracellular matrix is this hard bone-like material, you can imagine they're kind of trapped in there. So they actually have these little spaces that they live within that are called lacunae. And so you see that term right there, L-A-C-U-N-A-E. Lacunae are the holes that those living bone cells sit within. Okay? And then outside of that is going to be the hard bony matrix. So if we look at it, what we find is we're going to have that intercellular, right, between cellular material, which is going to have the calcium phosphate in it, the mineral matrix. It also has collagen in it, collagen fibers, which are large protein fibers for strength. The other thing that we'll see is, if we zoom up on it, right, here, again, was our compact bone, and we've zoomed up on it, and we see these large tree-like structures here that are called osteocytes. So that's the organizational unit inside of this compact bone. And we have these layers, they kind of look like trees, like you said, with tree rings. And the layers are called lamellae. And in between those layers, those little spider-like cells that you see here are the individual osteocytes. And they sit within spaces, this is another zoom up, the space around them is called the lacuna. Now notice there are these little connections between them, so they kind of look like little spiders. These little mini canals here, called canaliculi, allow these cells to pass nutrients, to pass waste products, to pass respiratory gases, etc., between each other. It's like a communication network. So these aren't cracks in the bone or anything like that, but since we have, like I mentioned, since we have this hard bony matrix, they can't just move their ways through some fluid or gel or whatever. So they have to have these little canals which allow them to communicate with each other, to now nutrients and oxygen to get from these blood vessels and get out to them. Okay? So these are the osteocytes. So the osteocytes are still living inside of the bony matrix. They have to maintain it and secrete it and then reabsorb it as necessary. Now at the surface here, right underneath this membrane here that's called the periosteum, we have these immature cells that are called osteo, that's the bone, blasts. And so the osteoblasts, like an explosion, these are really active cells that are generating the bony matrix. And so any growth that occurs in terms of the length of the bone or the diameter or the width of the bone occurs mainly according to these osteocytes that are at the surface that are actively working on the bone, like knitting bone together. Okay? The osteocytes are the mature bone cells. You know, when they get older and mature, they kind of slow down. They're still doing the work, but at a slower pace. The osteoblasts are the younger cells that are at the surface that are always actively. If you drink a bunch of milk with your cereal or something like that, that calcium that gets absorbed, a lot of it's getting routed to the bones, and it's those osteoblasts that are building bone. So you can think about that in terms of the letters. Osteoblasts build bone. So they're on the surface there, building that bone up and layering in that calcium, etc. Okay. So we have an idea now about some of the different cells that exist inside of bone. Osteocytes, mature cells, osteoblasts, these bone-building younger cells. And so when we are growing the bones, whether we're talking about kind of just the mineral deposits that occur on a weekly or daily basis, or whether you're talking about actual growth from when you were a baby to a toddler and through your young years, that type of growth occurs in two different ways. Okay? So the bones, when we form those bones originally, they can form in two different ways. One way is called intramembranous ossification. So those are called intramembranous bones. The other type of bone formation is called endochondral ossification. And chondro, whereas osteo means bone, chondro, or chondro like you see there, means cartilage. And so endochondral ossification is talking about a bone formation that occurs that replaces a cartilage model. So at first, it's kind of like if you were like pouring concrete or like making jello or something like that, you have to have a mold that is going to create the form first, and then you fill it in with whatever is going to, like the concrete, is going to make the final structure. So endochondral ossification, when you're talking about a fetus and that it's growing, those bones first, most of those bones have a cartilage formed first, made out of cartilage, the bone made out of a flexible cartilage. And then what we find is that the bone cells start to form inside of it, and it's almost like crystallization. Like you ever see ice form? It starts with like this little core of it, and then spreads out and spreads out and spreads out. Right now you have hard ice instead of fluid water. So you start out with a hyaline cartilage mold, if you will, first, that then gets replaced by bones. All right, so we'll talk about both these types of bone formation right now. The first type, like we said, is intramembranous ossification, or intramembranous bones. Of the 206 bones in the body, very few of them are formed in this way, okay? So basically the flat bones of the skull, these are called the cranial bones that you're going to be quizzed on with the lab quiz this weekend. Flat bones of the skull, like the frontal bone and the parietal bones, etc., are formed by this intramembranous ossification. And what happens, instead of having a cartilage mold like an intermediate, what happens is you start out immediately with bony tissue. So you get those osteoblasts that immediately start secreting bone around themselves and then start forming those cranial bones that surround the brain. Okay? So there's no intermediate. You go straight from kind of this generic, what we call mesenchymal cell, which is kind of like a stem cell, that then turns into osteoblasts, and then osteoblasts start building bone immediately. Okay? So the flat bones of the skull are made that way. Depending on where you read about it, maybe the clavicles might be formed that way. It's still kind of under debate. But all the rest of the bones of the body that you would think of are formed the second way in what we call endochondral ossification. So we have these osteoblasts first, intramembranous, that then end up secreting bones. And when they it's like they're building, like they have bricks or whatever, right? Or maybe even cement. They're pouring cement, and they're like, oh, great, look, I'm making all this new bone, And then all of a sudden, they're like, oh, darn it, I just totally enclosed myself, right? Because they're all building all around themselves. When they get fully enclosed in that bony matrix, now, all of a sudden, right, they have to slow down because they can't build. If they build any more, now they basically seal themselves off and build themselves in and they die, right? So now they have to slow down. They basically become an osteocyte at that point. So an osteoblast, when it's at the surface of the bone and it's building out here and backing up, then it's an active cell. But once it seals itself in, then it graduates to becoming an osteocyte. So when these cranial bones are first forming, osteoblasts build, and now all of a sudden I'm sealed in, now I'm an osteocyte. There are other osteoblasts at the surface. They'll continue to build, seal themselves in, and then it continues to grow that way. So in this case, we start out with, like I said, just a generic kind of mesenchymal or stem cell. We start out with osteoblasts building bones and then osteocytes, and now we actually have a bone that's developed. In the endochondral ossification, it's more of a two-step process. So we start out with these generic stem cells, mesenchymal cells, and then those go on to be cartilaginous cells, or chondrocytes first. So first we develop that hyaline cartilage model, and the second step is now we're going to have bone cells invade there and start to take it over and start to replace the cartilage. So if you look at here's our cartilaginous model. And you see those little bubbles in there? Those are the chondrocytes, and they actually sit in the little lacunae as well. Okay? Now notice that at some point, you see these blood vessels start growing in. We saw that with adult bone. And so the blood vessels go in there, and they actually start delivering some of our bone cells that are going to form. So the bone cells are now invading, and they're starting to secrete the bony matrix, and it's starting to spread. Like we said, kind of like ice forming. So it starts to spread through here. It starts in the center of the medullary cavity, and then it spreads outward. So what's happening here is the cartilage is slowly being replaced by bone as this migrates to the outside. Okay? So now you can see the second progression of it, right? It's still continuing to spread. And now you get secondary ossification centers that occur out here in the epiphysis as well. So it's like a war. You have the chondrocytes that were there originally. Now you have the invading osteocytes that start replacing and killing off the chondrocytes, and we start replacing that cartilage with bone. Ultimately, it's happening on multiple fronts. If we look at a mature bone, the only place that you have cartilage remaining is on the surface of the bone, like here and here. This is called articular cartilage. And this is where we want cartilage to be. When we have two bones articulating, we don't want two bones grinding on each other when they move. We want a little cushion there. So you have articular cartilage on the ends of these bones where they come together. And then you also have these little, what are called epiphyseal plates. And epiphyseal plates are also called growth plates. So these are, when you're younger, these are the places where we can allow the bone to continue to get longer as you get taller. Okay? So the bones get longer there. We maintain these little cartilaginous plates, and much like we were talking about before, the bone cells will kind of grow into that area, but in this case, the cartilage cells will kind of retreat, but they'll replace themselves as well. So as this kind of progresses, the bones actually get longer. Now, when you reach the age of whatever, 19, 20, 21 or so, then this whole growth and the whole cartilaginous plates, they end up getting tired, if you will, and the bones finally went out and replaced those cartilaginous growth plates. And now, instead of having an epiphyseal plate there, you have more of an epiphyseal line. So if you were doing x-rays of somebody who's younger, you would see these darkened areas of the bone where the cartilage still exists, the growth plates. But if you were to do an x-ray of an adult bone, that same bone, you would see one little line where finally the bone came together and then totally got rid of all the cartilage. And there's a thin line showing, not a scar necessarily, but where those two growth areas finally got rid of all that cartilage. Okay? So for most of you, you don't have any of those growth plates anymore. Now, there might be a little remnant of a line there, and that's it. And the only cartilage you have is on the very ends of bones, where those bones come together. Okay? So this is the way that most all the bones form in the body. They start out with a cartilage model first, then it gets invaded by those osteoblasts and osteocytes, and it gets replaced by bone. That's endochondral ossification. So that's how our bone, or bone tissue, arrives originally. Okay, so then we said, once we have mature bones forming our skeleton, it's kind of a dynamic process in terms of bone kind of creation or bone maintenance, if you want to consider it that way. So we said that the bone ends up being an area where we can store minerals, like calcium and phosphate and things like that. Well, in fact, that storage, like I said, it's like the refrigerator or the cupboard. You don't put it in there and never expect to get it out again. So when you're taking nutrients in, like calcium, etc., we're going to say, okay, well, we went to the store, we got all this calcium, let's put it on the shelf. Let's put it in the bones for when we need it later. And then it's the osteoblasts that will build it into the bone. They'll take it out of the blood and they'll knit together that extracellular matrix, that bony matrix, and make the bone. Okay? But then when you need calcium later, right, let's say when the muscles are contracting, you're at the gym or something like that, it takes calcium to make those muscles contract. So if you haven't had any calcium in a while, we're going to take it from the stores, from the bones, and we're going to put it into the blood that will then distribute it to the muscles that need it or whatever. There's a second type of cell called osteoclasts that are on the surface of the bone that actively chew up the bone instead. So that C in osteoclast always makes me think of these bone chewing cells. So if we need more calcium for something, like we said, like muscles contracting or something, these osteoclasts go to work, chew on the surface of the bone, eat up a little of that bony matrix. It makes ions, calcium ions and phosphate ions that then go into the blood, and those can route out to the different muscles or organs that need it. Okay? So it's this balance between building cells, the osteoblast, and then the osteoclast, that allow us to store these minerals and use these minerals inside the bone. And like that says, about 3 to 5% of bone calcium is actually exchanged annually. So given 20 years or so, that femur that you have, big thigh bone, is almost like fully recycled in terms of how much building and like withdrawing and building and withdrawing is going on. Okay? Lindsay's getting weirded out, just like thinking about all these cells inside her going eating at me and like secreting things and whatever. Don't worry though, these are your own cells. Even though they're actively working on their own, these are your own cells instead. Okay, so let's then, now we have an understanding about how this living tissue and living organs, how they're formed originally, how we maintain them, etc. So we need to finish up talking a little bit about bone function. As we were saying, support and protection, body movement. So most of the bones in your body, as they work with the skeletal muscles, allow for movement, but the bones themselves act as levers. So if you think about it, like think about how a shovel works or how tweezers work or something like that, a lever system, you've got some sort of rigid bar that you're moving. So again, sometimes the shovel is probably the easiest thing to think about. So the shovel, the main shaft of the shovel, that's your rigid bar. And then you also have these other components here. So the bar is going to be the bone, okay? But then you've got some sort of a pivot point too. So a pivot point, right, is going to be working like a seesaw or that shovel, right? Your one hand is going to be the pivot point. So that shovel is going to be turning around that. You shove it in, and then you pivot it around like that. So there's going to be the rigid bar, which is the bone, the pivot point, which will actually be the joint, where it's moving around. Then we have the object. Now usually the object, if we're talking about the shovel, that's the shovel full of dirt. But if you're talking about whatever, it could be your water bottle, you're like, this is the object, I want to move this. So here's our bar, here's our pivot point that we see right there. And then there's got to be some sort of force, awakening. No, I'm just kidding. You guys can run out and see that movie, the new Star Wars movie in December, maybe after class. Okay. So, regardless, the force in this case is just talking about the muscle. So the muscles provide the force, like with the shovel, to be able to move that lever, to be able to lift that particular object. Okay? So the bones give us that lever of these lever systems. Okay, so that's how they help to produce movement. In terms of blood cell formation, we talked about this already. It's the red bone marrow that produces the red blood cells, white blood cells, etc. The yellow bone marrow is just fat instead. So we mentioned that in terms of its kind of relationship to other systems of the body, like cardiovascular system, etc. Storage of salt or bony matrix. We said that calcium is the main ion that we're thinking of, but phosphate is the other one that actually attaches to the calcium. So we use phosphate for other things in terms of the body. We said that calcium, in terms of storing it, it's an interesting dynamic. So how do we know? How do the osteoblasts know when's the appropriate time to build bone as opposed to the osteoclast chewing up bone? Well, in the body, in all the systems of the body, there are two different organ systems that are responsible for control and coordination. So that's one thing to remind yourself of, is that in chapter 1 of the things we did in chapter 1 is we went through all of the different organ systems, the 11 different organ systems, be able to name them and describe kind of what they do overall. Obviously, throughout the semester, we're going to be learning the details about how they do that, but we did an introduction for that even in chapter 1. So if on the exam I said, name 5 organ systems of the body and describe what they do, you should be able to do that because we went over that in chapter 1. All right, so 2 management systems of the body, nervous system and endocrine system. Nervous system is the wired system, bzz, bzz, tells the muscle to contract or tells a gland to secrete or something like that immediately. Endocrine system is one where we release a hormone into the blood, it circulates around, and then it ends up at a target organ and tells it what to do. So it works kind of the same, but endocrine's a little bit slower because it has to go around in circulation instead. In this case, in terms of bony matrix and maintenance, etc., it is relying on 2 different hormones that control how the calcium is stored in the bone or removed from the bone. So one of the hormones is pretty straightforward in terms of its name, called calcitonin, right? So calcitonin comes from the thyroid gland. So the thyroid gland, we'll learn later on, is a kind of butterfly-shaped gland that's right here around the throat or the pharynx. And one of the hormones it's put out is calcium. So when the blood calcium levels are high, so say you just went to In-N-Out or something like that and got a big milkshake, that's a massive influx of calcium that your body's like, I don't know, what am I going to do with this? So at that point, there are different receptors around the body that can actually sense the amount of calcium and says, oh, there's too much calcium in the blood, let's store it into the bones. So the thyroid gland gets that signal that we have a lot of calcium around. It releases calcitonin that then goes down to those osteoblasts and tells those osteoblasts, let's take that calcium out of the blood and knit it into the bone so that we can store it for later. Okay? So when blood calcium levels are high, calcitonin is going to signal it to be stored into the bone, build the bone up. Okay? On the opposite side of the coin, parathyroid hormone does the opposite. So if our calcium levels are running low around the body, we can remove calcium from the bone and give it to the organs that need it. And parathyroid hormone does that. Parathyroid glands are actually these pea-shaped glands that are on the backside of the thyroid, And when that hormone comes out, it tells the osteoblasts, okay, you need to slow it down, no more building, let's get those osteoclasts going to chew things up. Okay? So that's the way that we can actually control that type of calcium storage and removal. But the bone also contains a number of other different types of ions and minerals. So magnesium, sodium, potassium, and even carbonate ions, which can be used for a variety of different purposes in different cells. Like all the muscles when they contract and the nerve or the neurons when they signal, they need the movement of sodium and potassium across their membranes in order to make that work. So we've got to be able to store that in places too. Now in truth, because there's a lot of building going on in the bones, if there are harmful elements going around in the blood, so if you've inhaled them, if you have ingested them or something like that, sometimes they can get included into the build. It's like if you're painting or something, and you're not careful, and there's a lot of dust or something, or a hair, you're painting, it's like, oh, now all that stuff is stuck in there, right? So the same thing in terms of building bones. So if there are things that are chemicals that are irradiated, or things like lead or something like that from paints, and you're eating paint, right? The body metabolizes that just like anything else. And it's like, what am I going to do with it? We're like, well, we'll store it over here along with the calcium, etc. So it doesn't really know any better. It tries to process it like anything that you take in. So it can be a problem as well. Okay. So now what we've done is we've done kind of our big picture of skeletal system. Its main functions, what the bones are, etc. Now most of the rest of this chapter, there are a few other topics we're going to be addressing, but most of the rest of this chapter, as you may be seeing, is a whole bunch of pictures, a bunch of diagrams of the different bones and naming the bones. And that's what you're going to be doing for lab, to be sure. Like the cranial bone, you need to be able to name all the different bones of the skull. When you get to appendicular, you've got to name all the different bones throughout the body, right? The different bones of the hand, or the different bones of the forearm, the arm, or whatever. You don't have to name the bony markings. If you're doing this for a year-long course, like we're nursing, you have to do each little bump and pull and dip, etc. Because what happens there is that particular bump, there's a tendon for a muscle that attaches to that particular bump. And so if you're learning the muscles and specifically what they do, you actually need to learn those bony markings. Like a nerve passes through there, or a blood vessel goes through that hole, etc. But for you guys, just knowing the names of the individual bones is the most important thing. Okay? Okay, so like we said, two different divisions of the skeleton. The axial skeleton that you see here in orange versus the appendicular skeleton that you see in yellow instead. Okay? So axial skeleton, skull, as well as vertebrae, as well as ribs, and then on the anterior side, our sternum kind of connecting that through. For the appendicular skeleton, it's going to be bones of the limbs and those bones that connect the limbs to the axial skeleton. Okay? So, let's take a look, just a brief cruise through some of the axial skeleton and appendicular skeleton. The skull is what we're going to be focusing on this week. 8 cranial bones, 13 facial bones, and then the mandible. What's the mandible? Jaw. Now, again, you're going to start to see more specific terms than what you knew previously. You're like upper jaw, lower jaw. Mandible, maxilla up here. So they have distinct names instead. So the mandible is that jaw or lower jaw. So each of the colors that you see here represents a different bone. And it's helpful because in some cases, you can see there's a bone here that contributes to the eye socket called the sphenoid bone. But you can also see a side of it helps to form the lateral side of the skull as well in terms of protecting the side. So those colors do tend to help in terms of locating where one bone starts and one bone stops. Now where these bones come together, particularly in the skull, we have these fibrous joints which are called sutures. Okay? And there are some specific sutures that you need to know. This one that goes across the top here is called the coronal suture, right? Like a coronal plane, like we talked about before, is dividing into an anterior and posterior. So there's a big frontal bone here, and there's a coronal suture which attaches the frontal bone to the 2 parietal bones high on the sides here. There's also a series of other ones that we'll see if we look at different views of the skull too. There's a lambdoidal suture, there's a sagittal suture that's right here. Looks like a mohawk that I'm drawing it, but it's basically right here between the 2 parietal bones. It's sewing them together along here. It's along the mid-sagittal cut, so they call it a sagittal suture. It runs along the top as well. So you do need to know some of those major sutures. Not these little ones that we see here, but the major ones that connect the different cranial bones. Okay, so here we can see some of them. There's the coronal suture again. Here, back here is called the lambdoidal one. This is the occipital bone. And the lambdoidal suture connects the occipital bone to these parietal bones up here. We can see this one along the side here is called the squamosal suture. So some of those major sutures you do need to know, as well as these individual bones, like the maxilla bone and the zygomatic bone, which is the cheekbone, etc. Okay, so skull and cranium, definitely part of the axial-skeleton. If we go down along that main axis, we go to the vertebrae as well. So the vertebral bone is a whole bunch of what we call irregular bones. We can kind of classify bones as flat bones, like the cranium, long bones, like say, like the humerus and the femur. A lot of the ones in the appendicular skeleton are long bones. And then when we get to the vertebral bones, these are, they call irregular bones. They have all these weird projections. They don't have a general category for them. So irregular bones of the vertebral column, each individual vertebra is a bone. And we have these different regions of them as well. So probably somewhere along the way, you may have had some sort of stress or like pressure or something like that, some sort of problem with some of those bones in one of the regions. Cervical vertebrae are going to be those of the neck, okay, and there are 7 of those. Then we get to the thoracic vertebrae of the chest. Then we get to the lumbar vertebrae of the lower back before you get to that triangular shaped bone, which is the sacrum, and then the coccyx is the tailbone that's down below. Okay? So for all the different vertebrae that occur along the vertebral column, they all have these different parts of them. So for instance, this section right here is called the body. They have this little spine that sticks out right here, which is called the spinous process. The spinous process is all these little bumps that you have right through the center right there. Those are the spinous processes of each of the different vertebrae as they're going down. There are also transverse processes that come out along the sides over there for each one of these. So each one of the vertebrae has some generic, if you will, characteristics that almost all of them have, like these different processes in the body, etc. But then you'll also learn some specific aspects that allow you to tell the difference between cervical, thoracic, and lumbar bones. So we'll see that coming up too. Okay? Now, for these vertebrae, there are, like we said, 7 of the cervical vertebrae, 12 of the thoracic, and 5 of the lumbar vertebrae. On a certain level, you can think about the different times of day you might eat, which gives you the number of these different vertebrae, right? So 7 a.m., 12 noon, 5 p.m. None of you guys eat at those times, really. Like midnight or 2 in the morning or something like that. But if you think about how one might eat at those times, it will help you to know how many vertebrae we have in all these different sections that you see there. All right. So when we look at the cervical vertebrae, we do like a little tour. The cervical vertebrae are unique as well. So the cervical vertebrae, the first 2 of them are very unique. So we said that we have 7 cervical vertebrae. The first 2 are very interesting ones. You can see they even look a little bit different. The first one is called the Atlas. So you guys ever heard of a character named Atlas? Mythology? Right? Yeah, so he's got the globe, he's got the world on his back. So that first cervical vertebrae has your big globe on its back. So that's where it gets its name. So the first cervical vertebra forms a joint with the occipital bone on the inferior side, and it holds up your head. Okay? So it's very broad and flat, and these facets, these little flat parts here, here, and here is where the skull rests. Okay? So, a unique thing about the Atlas is it doesn't have a big body to it. So most of these different vertebrae, like we were mentioning, let me see if I can get a shot, have a big body to them like this. And that's where a lot of the weight is resting between the different vertebrae. But for that first one, notice it doesn't have that big body to it. So the Atlas is kind of unique that way. The other thing we'll notice when we look at the Atlas, the first cervical vertebrae, and the axis, the second one, is you see this pattern where they have these transverse foramina. A foramen is a hole. So the vertebral foramen, all vertebrae have this vertebral foramen here, What do you think goes through there?
Spinal cord?
Spinal cord, exactly. So much like the cranium and the skull is protecting the brain and some of the soft structures there, this vertebral column is protecting the spinal cord all the way down. It creates a big canal that it rings around. So each one has a vertebral foramen in the inside of it. Now, the cervical vertebrae have additional holes on the side that allow these blood vessels, called vertebral arteries, etc., to be able to get up to the brain to help draw blood to the brain. So it's only these cervical ones that have those extra transverse processes on them. Okay, so we have the atlas, which is C1. We have the axis, which is C2. Now, axis, if you think about an axis like the globe spinning on an axis or something like that, in essence, that's kind of what the role of C2, the axis, is. So we have the atlas holding up the globe. The atlas sits on the axis, and they form a pivot joint, right? So when you do this, when you shake your head no, okay, that's the atlas and the axis rotating upon one another. So the axis has this little bony projection that you see right there that's called the dens that sticks up. And that sticks up right in here, and it helps to form, again, this joint where the atlas and the axis can turn with each other, allowing you that type of action. Okay, so that's why that particular one has its name. And that dens that we see there, that's exclusive to that C2 vertebrae, it's the axis. Okay, so then you move down to the thoracic vertebrae, and this slide does a good job of comparing the different vertebrae from the different regions. So again, here we see, again, a cervical vertebrae. Here are extra transverse foramen for those extra blood vessels. When we get to the thoracic vertebrae, what we find is the spinous process that comes out posteriorly is much longer and pointed. This one was shorter, and oftentimes it's bifurcated. It has a split to it. Okay? Get to the thoracic one, it's much longer in terms of the spinous process. It also has these extra little facets. If you ever had a gemstone ring, and it's a bigger gem, you know, because you guys all have big diamond rings and everything as college students, but if you look at some sort of a gem, they often have cuts on them that are called facets, right? A flattened area. So when you have a bone that has a flattened area, they often call it a facet. And the thoracic vertebrae have facets here on the transverse processes, as well as along the sides of the body. And those facets are where the ribs attach. So when that rib is attached to it and touches it, it produces a little flat area to form that joint. And it's only the thoracic vertebrae that have the ribs attached to them. So it's only the thoracic vertebrae that have those extra little facets like that. Okay? Now, when we get down to the lumbar vertebrae here, the lower back vertebrae, they're supporting most of the weight of the torso. So they necessarily need to be much bigger, massive. They have a big body to them to support all of that weight. The spinous processes and the transverse processes are a little bit shorter, so we don't want them snapping off or anything like that. So it's just bigger overall. So do know that we have 3 different categories of vertebrae. You'll see that as you come to the lab and the lab quiz this weekend. You do need to know the individual parts of a vertebrae, like where's the spinous process and the transverse process, etc. But you need to be able to tell the difference between a lumbar and a cervical and a thoracic vertebrae as well. Okay? Okay. When we get down towards the end of that spinal column, we have the sacrum. The sacrum and the coccyx are interesting because once upon a time in evolutionary history, these actually were individual vertebrae. So you can see here, these dividing lines. So this used to be a vertebra right here. That's one vertebra. This is another vertebra right here. This is another one that was right here. Okay, so it looks like the transverse processes, the bodies, etc. But through time, through evolutionary time and the change in terms of the movement and things like that and weight support, these ended up fusing. So in truth, this is the fusion, the sacrum is the fusion of 5 different vertebrae. And then what's left is, rather than having the spaces between the transverse processes, you just have these holes instead. And the coccyx down here, that's a series of 3 to 4 individual bones as well. Now, we don't have tails or anything like that, but if you have a dog or a cat, they actually have elongated bones that go into the tail. So this is something like that, but we don't have a tail, so this is just kind of a remnant from something like that. So the end of the spinal column itself, this helps to form the pelvis, because we're going to have two pelvic bones that are coming around the sides, and this is what connects them on the posterior side to form that kind of bowl that we call a pelvis, to form that pelvic cavity, house those pelvic organs, like the end of the intestine and the bladder and stuff like that. Okay? Okay. So the rest of the axial skeleton consists of what we call the thoracic cage. So the thoracic cage is going to be the different ribs and then also the sternum. So when we look at that, right, here are different thoracic vertebrae from the other side. Here are the bodies, and you can see where the ribs are attaching to them. Okay? So the ribs attach here posteriorly and then curve around. And notice that there's a piece of cartilage here that connects the rib to the sternum. So these are examples of cartilaginous joints that we'll talk about probably next time. Okay? So these are examples of cartilaginous joints, how this rib bone connects to the sternum like we see here. Now notice when we look at all these ribs, there are 12 pairs of ribs. So that means 24 ribs altogether. Now I can tell you, unless there's been some sort of surgery or something like that, women and men have the same number of ribs. Besides the whole Adam and Eve thingamajigger, right? Same number of ribs. 12 pairs in men and women. Okay? Unless, like I said, you've had some sort of surgery where you want the hourglass figure, corset and all that. Sometimes there have been women that have had some of the last ribs removed, because then if you have the ribs removed, you just have soft tissue in here. You can collapse it more, you can get that true hourglass shape. A little extreme, but 12 pairs of ribs. Now, as I was saying, most of these go through and connect to the sternum via cartilage directly. See there, all the way through. Now, when we get down to the seventh one, that's the last one that connects directly. Notice 8, 9, and 10 have to hitchhike onto the one above it in order to attach to the sternum. So 1 through 7 are called true ribs because they have a true and direct connection to the sternum. 8, 9, 10, 11, and even 12 are called false ribs. It's not that they're fake ribs. They are true ribs, they're bone, etc., but they don't have a direct connection to the sternum. 8, 9, and 10, those ones have to piggyback, like we mentioned. 11 and 12 are actually called the floating ribs. They attach to the vertebrae on the posterior side, but they don't attach at all to the sternum. They're still ribs, but they don't have a direct connection. They don't have any connection whatsoever on the front side. Okay, so we've got the different types of ribs. Then we have that, like we said, our sternum. It kind of looks like a tie, right? So this part at the top here, this part looks like the knot of the tie. It's called the manubrium. This main part that kind of looks like a sword through here is called the body. And then there's this little triangular area right here, which is called the xiphoid process. So the xiphoid process can be important when you're talking about CPR. So if you're talking about CPR and doing compressions, you want to be able to put the main palms of your hands on top of the sternum in order to compress the heart, in order to push the blood out, etc. You don't want it down the stomach or anything. There's going to be bad issues occurring there. So you want it up on the sternum. In order to locate the sternum, you're going to palpate, you're going to use your fingers, you're going to feel along the soft tissue, and then you're going to get to that little pointy xiphoid process there. Once you get to the xiphoid process, they're talking about at least 2 fingers up from there, and then you're putting the butt of your hand there and you're assured that you're on the body of the sternum as opposed to down low. If you take it and you end up down in the xiphoid process, that's just a little bit of fibrous connective tissue connecting it that can actually dislocate. It can actually snap, especially if you get somebody who's older and you're compressing down there, it can actually go beep and can snap there. Of course, you can break ribs as well because those bits of cartilage there can separate. You can dislocate ribs. You can break ribs, but having a broken rib is much better than just being dead, right? So in most cases, even if because you really got to get those compressions going, right? You've been trained on that. It's not just like, that's not going to do anything. You're like right on top of them. You're maintaining the straight up and you're pushing hard in order to get that blood circulating around. So sometimes these things will dislocate or break, but you want to make sure that the placement is right there on the body of the sternum. So in that case, xiphoid process has a functional aspect of it that can potentially save life if you're doing it right. Okay, So what we found is that through the axial skeleton, we're talking about these bones that are associated with the main axis of the body. When we then switch into the appendicular skeleton, we're talking about the bones that are in the appendages as well as the bones that attach them to the main torso. Okay? So these are those bones that attach to the main torso, the pectoral and the pelvic girdles. So men and women both have girdles that they wear around. See, you're learning all kinds of new things, right? So pectoral girdles, you think about pecs and pectoralis. That refers to like the pectoralis major muscles, the pectoralis minor muscle, etc. But the pectoral girdle then is going to be the bones that effectively kind of make up the shoulder joint that attach the upper limb to the body. So the pectoral girdle is going to be the scapula and the clavicles. So the clavicle is going to be the collarbone. You can't call it collarbone anymore. Now you got to use that fancy word clavicle. And the scapula, which is mainly here, a triangular shaped bone, an irregular shaped, triangular shaped bone. So pectoral girdle is this one here, clavicle, and this one here, scapula. So you can see how it connects the upper limb to the axial skeleton. So those are the two bones that are part of the pectoral girdle. Now the rest of them, when we get to upper limb, they're pretty simple. You have this one, the humerus. Now notice that with the bones of the lower limb and the upper limb, there is a big similarity to them. With the more proximal part, you have one bone, and then when you go to the distal part, you have two bones. When you look at the bones of the wrist and the ankle and the bones of the foot and the hand, they're basically the same. They may be bigger or smaller, arranged a little bit differently, but same number, and kind of the relationship is the same. So this is the humerus, right? So this is technically the funny bone, right? So when you hit your elbow and you're like, oh, I hit my funny bone, the name of this bone is where that comes from. So this is the humerus, okay? Now technically, on the posterior side, there's actually some nerves that are passing through here. The ulnar nerve on the medial side goes right through here, passes right through there. So when you bang your elbow on that medial side, you're hitting right on that nerve. And so that's when people are talking about, oh, I hit my funny bone. It's actually the nerve that's kind of cramping there like that. But the end of that bone is the humerus. And the bony projections there, where the nerve is, that's where you get that whole idea of the funny bone. Okay, so humerus is the main upper bone. The forearm bones are going to be the radius and the ulna. Now, in anatomical position like this, remember anatomical position, the radius is always going to be associated with the thumb, usually on the lateral side. So this is going to be the radius here, and then the ulna will be over here. Radius here, ulna here. When we get to the appendicular quiz, they're going to be asking you, okay, just point to this one or point to that one. You know radius on the side of the thumb. The radius contributes more to the wrist joint down here. You can see there's more of the thicker part of the bone and the radius down distally. The ulna is what helps to make that elbow joint, that hinge joint up there. It's got a big C or U shape cut out of it, you see up there. That helps to, number one, identify it as ulna because it's got a U shape to it. But that's the part that fits with the humerus that forms this joint right there. The radius is still there, but you can see it's just a tiny little part at the head of the radius that's up there at the elbow. So it doesn't really contribute as much to that joint. Okay, so when you get down to the wrist and the hands, these little bones right here, we just collectively call the carpals. So you hear about carpal tunnel syndrome and stuff like that. There's a bunch of tendons that route out to the fingers and the hand, go right through a bunch of connective tissue there. That type of repetitive motion, etc., can lead to swelling there as they move through that connective tissue tunnel, and that swelling then gives you pain. But the bones that are underlying it are called the carpals. They each have their own individual name, but collectively, bones of the wrist here are the carpals, bones of the hand here are called metacarpals, and then these bones out here are called the phalanges. Now notice that there's kind of a numbering system. Start with the thumb, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So this would be the third metacarpal right here. If you go to the phalanges, it is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 again, but there's 3 bones out here. Proximal, middle, distal. So that bone right here, if you were to break it or like cut it off or something like that, okay, This would be the 1, 2, 3. This is the third distal phalanx. That one is. This is the third middle phalanx. That's the third proximal phalanx. So phalanges is the way that we would say all of those bones together. Those are the phalanges. Okay. Pelvic girdle, really pretty similar to what we find with the pectoral girdle. Now the pectoral girdle, it's a ball and socket joint. And so with a ball and socket joint, you get a lot of movement with it, right? The ball is the head of the humerus, so it gets a lot of movement, a lot of different angles. And then you've got a socket, which is on the scapula. But the socket for the scapula is pretty shallow, which means you can get a lot of movement to it, a lot of angular flexibility, etc. You go to the hip joint, it's also a ball and socket joint, but we've got a lot of weight of the upper body on it. So we can't have all this willy-nilly flexibility like this. We got to have some more support to it. So you still, for the femur, you have a big ball of it, and then in terms of the socket, you've got a really deep socket called the acetabulum. You see there in the middle? You got a deep socket in these coxal bones right here that really kind of almost fully cover the head of the femur. And that way, you get a lot more support to it. You can still get the whole angular motion, but it's not going to be slipping out until you get older and things kind of wear away and it gets more shallow. Then dislocation of the hip or the femur can be possible. But generally, it's very well supported and surrounded, and so that gives you some of the movement, but more structure, more support for that hip joint instead. Okay. Just going through the rest of that, femur, our big thigh bone, right? There's the head of it, like we mentioned. When you go down to the leg bone, you have two bones of the leg. Now, here's the thing about spelling, that example that I keep using, right? Two bones of the leg. The larger bone is called the tibia, and that's on the medial side. The smaller, thinner bone is called the fibula, okay? If we're going through and you're trying to identify it, and somehow you write on a quiz or on the exam, you write this word. Oh. Now I don't know what you're talking about, right? Because all you did was change one letter, but now this word is exactly halfway between those two. So I don't know if you actually knew what you were talking about and you just missed a letter, or you actually got the totally wrong bone, okay? So spelling does count when we're talking about getting to the exam and things like that. It does count. I'll give you some leeway if it's one letter or two. It's not a big deal. If you really butcher the word, but I can still tell what you meant, then I may have to take half credit off, okay? But spelling is important. When you're going to be doing charting or something like that, you need to know, because if you write down this rather than this, or some hybrid of it, somebody looking at that chart later on isn't going to know what you're talking about. So tibia is more medial. This is your shin bone. The whole song and stuff like that, foot bone connected to the shin bone or whatever. That's your shin right there, the tibia. Fibula is actually buried within a lot of muscle along the lateral side there. The rest of them, when we get to ankle and foot, again, some irregular bones here. We call them the tarsals, like toes, tarsals instead of carpals. Metatarsals of the foot, numbered the same, starting with the big toe. And then look at this. This is always weird. Phalanges. Finger bones and toe bones have the exact same number. I don't get that at all, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, proximal, middle, distal, phalanx or phalanges. They have the exact same name whether you're talking about that or whether you're talking about your second toe. So, in terms of naming those bones, it will come up when you get to your different labs associated with that particular skeleton. All right. Given our situation, what we have here is we just have a little bit more of this chapter to do next time. So we're going to talk about two major topics. One is, what do we call these things, and what are the structure of these different joints where bones come together and how we can classify them. The second topic is just talking about movements that can occur at joints, like we said, like rotation, extension, flexion, and things like that. Those are the only two things that we have to cover still for this chapter. After we get done with that next time, then we're just going to review. So we're going to try to look over all of the different material that we had in the chapters leading up to this. We'll have some practice questions maybe that we can go over, answer any questions. So take a look over everything if you can. Take a look through things between now and Thursday. So if something comes up where you're like, I don't know if I know this very well, we can talk about it when we're reviewing. The only other thing I would remind you of is the study lab downstairs is now open all of its full hours. Now, that's not saying it's open 24 hours a day or even 8 hours a day. But we do have times and days there. Every day of the week, it's open some hours. There's some afternoon, evening, morning hours. So if you need help, there's always a tutor in there. They've got the models in there and things like that you're seeing pictures of. So if you want to get your hands on things or ask questions, that's also another place where you can find help. Of course, I have office hours as well. Down there or up there, my office hours are posted in that first module that we saw. It says Dr. C's office hours. I've updated those. They're all listed there. So if you have questions, email me, come in to see, etc. So we've got a week to go. We can start shoring up all of our knowledge and preparation now. Okay? All right. See you on Thursday.
I know, right?
It depends. So, the thyroid, yeah, go ahead. Right. So, with that, there's different types of thyroid disease, whether it's too much, too little, etc. There's two different hormones that thyroid puts out. One is thyroid hormone, or T3, T4, etc. The other one is actually calcitonin, like I mentioned before. They're put out by two different cells that come from the same organ. So if the thyroid gland is, for whatever reason, malfunctioning, overall, it could affect the calcitonin level and its ability to regulate calcium deposition or reabsorption from the bone. On the other hand, if it's just like the thyroid hormone itself, the T3, T4, then those hormones tend to control overall metabolism. Like how if you want to consider how fast the cellular machinery runs, like the motor of it, right? So it burns through energy quickly or not, etc. So in terms of bones on that level, I don't know if there's a direct correlation with thyroid hormone and calcium specifically. If you're talking about metabolism overall, again, less thyroid hormone, a lot of the cells are going to tend to slow down. So you might feel lethargic, and so energy stores are going to increase because you're not burning energy, etc. And maybe that applies to the cells within the bones too. So they're not as active in terms of putting bony matrix in or something like that. Meanwhile, if it flips the other way, everything gets hyperactive, then your heart rate goes up and you start losing weight because you're burning energy, etc. So maybe the bones could be affected by that in terms of their activity increasing too.
Because I'm pretty educated on thyroid disease, but I've never even heard of it having anything to do with calcium and the bones, which I think is a little iffy considering the fact that I know so much about it, and I have never even broached that subject by anyone. So that's just one
So the difference there is that, like you said, so the thyroid hormone as a hormone coming out of the thyroid and the calcitonin as a separate hormone, they come from two distinct cell populations in the thyroid. So oftentimes, if you're talking about thyroid disease, it's really affecting those that put out the thyroid hormone that regulate metabolism, and the ones that put out calcitonin may not be affected at all.
Well, see, what made me think about it is Hashimoto's is where someone flips from hyper to hypo consistently. And if the entire thyroid is being affected and going back and forth, I figured that if it's producing that chemical, it should be affecting in some way, shape, or form. And I was just wondering if you knew what was going on with that, because I've never heard anything about it.
It could be. The other thing